Good morning, everybody. We'll just get ready to start our new session. My name's Ruben Brawny. I'm the exec lead for policy, innovation, and engagement with the Public Service Agency. And I'm here to introduce our next guest speaker. But before I do, I've been asked to just say a few words share my perspective on why this whole conversation around digital government and digital public service is so important, because it's a conversation that is increasingly active amongst my colleagues at corporate executive level. And I think what's interesting is that we'll talk a lot over the next 2 days about sort of the what and how of digital government. What I don't think we often necessarily think about quite as much and quite as deeply is why that's so important. Alex, I think, talked quite a bit this morning about sort of some of the challenges and the imperatives and the things that are pushing us, but one that we don't explore often enough is the issue of public trust. And so all those of you here who are employees of the BC Public Service like me will fondly remember that you took an oath when you started your career. And in that oath, we promised a bunch of things: impartially serve government, do our jobs to the best of our ability. One of the things we also said was we wouldn't just do our jobs, we would do our jobs in ways that maintain and enhance the public's trust and confidence in the public service. And that's really important. And there's a reason for that. Trust has been described as the primary criterion for success of the public service. Our ability to do our jobs, our ability to exist as an institution, if you really want to get kind of deep about it, is contingent on the public's level of trust in our system of government and in our role as a public service. So in that context, I look at things like, I think it was last week, the big public opinion research firm Ipsos released their latest report on global citizens' trust in different professions around the world. And they break out different professions, and everybody loves teachers and doctors. Most people like the military, they trust the police. But they ask citizens in a bunch of different countries how trustworthy they consider different professions to be. And if you look at the Canadian results, happily, they actually ask about civil servants. Unhappily, the response is that less than a quarter of Canadians consider civil servants to be trustworthy. Now, we're not uniquely at that level. We're not especially low on that scale. But I find that personally kind of troubling. But more importantly, I think we institutionally should find that troubling. Because that's really why this whole conversation is so important, right? The conversation about how we become a digital government and digital public service and more effective at that isn't really just about service delivery and policies and structures and processes. Those are all important elements of how we get there. But really what it is how do we shape and determine the role and relevance of the public service in a digitally enabled world? And so I say that, and I share that 24% trustworthiness scale, not because I want to make us all feel bad, but because I think it adds a bit of impetus and urgency. Because I worry about what that means 50 years from now, but I also worry about what that means for us right now. And so on the upside, I think how we respond to this whole challenge of digital is actually part of how we solve that problem. I think there's the potential for us to really rethink how we work in a way that, while it's deploying technology, actually can fundamentally make us a more human institution, and that will make us a more trustworthy institution in the eyes of the people we serve. And I think the role of leadership in how we solve that equation is particularly profound and important. And you've already heard a little bit about that. And to elaborate on that now, I'd like to introduce Ryan Androsoff. And so Ryan has over 2 decades of experience working in digital government space, including with the federal government, the Canadian Digital Service, but also in the US and in Europe, has done work with OECD in Paris around their digital government work, and is currently working with the Institute on Government on their digital leadership curriculum that they've just rolled out in the last year or so, and he's going to tell us a bit more about that. So please join me in welcoming Ryan Androsoff.
Thanks so much, Ruben. Thanks so much, Ruben, and thanks to all of you for having me here today. It's great to be here in Victoria as part of Connect 2019, and as we were talking to a couple people at the break, for me, having spent a lot of time working on these issues at the federal level and internationally, I think there's some really interesting pockets of work that are happening here in British Columbia, and so I'm really excited to meet some of the folks behind that and learn a bit more about your story. As Ruben said, the last couple years, the issue that's really been on my mind a lot and that I've been thinking about a lot is around digital leadership and digital literacy. From the time I have spent in the federal government and working in a variety of jurisdictions, both in Canada and around the world, on issues around how do we modernize government, I really do think one of the challenges we face is ensuring that we have a public sector and particularly public service leaders who understand how the digital world works. Because if we don't have that, a lot of the ambitions and a lot of the things that we're trying to accomplish are going to be difficult for us to be able to put in place. So as Ruben mentioned, the work I'm doing right now with the Institute on Governance, which is a nonpartisan think tank and learning organization based out of Ottawa, is very much trying to tackle that. And I'm going to talk at the end of the presentation a bit about some of the work that we're doing, but I want to talk first about why this matters and what the journey looks like that I think governments around the world have been facing, and why that makes this issue of digital competencies and digital leadership so important and so central to, I think, everything we're talking about over the next couple of days here. So government has been on a digital journey for many decades now, and I would argue it kind of roughly breaks down into three phases. So for those who were in government in the mid-1990s, early 2000s, around 20 years ago, at the federal level they called it government online, but really every jurisdiction around the world was, for the first time, responding to this new thing that was out there called the internet. And they were taking services, information that up until that point had only existed in paper formats. You might be able to call a call center to get information or go to a service desk, and they were moving it online for the first time. They were taking these very much analog ways of getting information and making them digital. And there was large investments that were put into making this happen. And actually Canada was widely regarded as an international leader in the early 2000s in what people were calling e-government. We then saw, about 10 years ago, the rise of what people called Government 2.0. And Government 2.0 was very much about the introduction of social media. Things like Facebook and Wikipedia and YouTube, which we take for granted today, were brand new. And they really were changing the paradigm of how citizens were interacting with institutions, including government, and were forcing government to think about engagement in a very, very different way. And we've now, in the last couple of years, moved into what people are increasingly calling digital government. And I do think digital government is something that is distinctly different from those other phases. It's more than just putting information online or services online. It's more than just communicating through these new social platforms. I think digital government is really forcing us to think about how can we take all of these new technologies and start reimagining government processes from the bottom up. So it's not simply putting a coat of digital paint on top of rusted out processes, but it's actually using the tools and the affordability and the scale of these tools today to reimagine government processes in an entirely different way. Well, what do we mean by digital? Just to even go a little bit more basic, because I do think digital is a buzzword and it gets thrown around and can mean a lot of different things for a lot of different people. I quite like this quote from Tom Loosemore, who was one of the co-founders of the Government Digital Service in the UK. And Tom talks about digital as being the application of the culture and practices and processes and technologies of the internet era to respond to people's raised expectations. And so I think the two sides of the equation that he lays out are really important to understand. On the one hand, Tom is talking about that this is more than just the technology, though the technology is driving this. It is that set of practices and processes and cultural norms that go along with it. Things that we often will associate with the startup world, be it user-centered design, as we just heard about in the previous session, be it agile management practices. So it is more than just the technology, it is those processes and practices around it. And the other side of the equation is the rising expectations of citizens. So the reality is that the people that you serve, that folks in the federal government serve, the people in governments around the world serve, are living in a Netflix and an Amazon world. And their standard for service delivery and ease of use and transparency are being driven by their private sector experiences. And so increasingly governments have struggled to keep pace and to be able to meet those same expectations. Governments have also struggled in a much broader sense in terms of keeping pace with the changing world and the rate of technological adaptation. This is a graph that I like to use, and it looks at the adaptation of new technologies over time. And so if you look at the far left of the graph, it looks at technologies like the telephone or electricity or radios or cars, which took upwards of 3 to 4 decades in many cases to go from invention and introduction to the marketplace to mass adaptation. If you look at the right-hand side of the graph, we see things like smartphones and social media and tablets, and that rate of change almost becomes vertical. New technologies that are being introduced are being adapted by the masses in a matter of years, if not months. And so for institutions like government, this has required them to be able to adapt much faster. Whereas in the past, often they had an entire generation to be able to adapt their practices and processes to these new technological innovations in society. Now we're being asked to do it in months. And a lot of our institutions haven't been designed to be able to cope with that pace of change. At the same time, we're also seeing technology impacting us in a personal way, which is causing us to be able, as a society, to have to adapt to these disruptions. This is an interesting kind of concept graph from an organization called the Center for Humane Technology out of the US. It was founded just last year from a couple of former Google engineers who were starting to get really worried about the societal impacts of some of the technology platforms that they had helped to build and that are frankly ubiquitous in our lives now. And their argument is that we often kind of focus these discussions on that point when technology is going to overwhelm human capabilities, right? This is kind of some of the stuff Alex talked about this morning in terms of kind of self-aware AI and technology that'll dramatically change our economy, change society in ways that we can't foresee right now. And I think that is a very real possibility in the coming decades. But their argument is that there's a much earlier point where technology overwhelms our human vulnerabilities, and that we've likely already passed that point. And this is driving a lot of the conversation right now around fake news and how social media is in many ways amplifying very negative emotional and societal trends in a way that necessarily isn't healthy for people. And so I think one of these other interesting lenses that we're increasingly having a discussion around at a society level basis is how do we use technology in a way that supports us as people? And not just view it as a productivity tool, but view it as something that has very human implications behind it. And we are seeing that Canadians are very much split on this. Canadians are very much split on the notion of, will technology ultimately help or harm us? This is some interesting work that Ipsos has been doing over the last couple of years, and I really encourage you to check out their broader research study called Canada Next, where they've been looking at Canadians' views on technology. And they find that Canadians are essentially split down the middle. That half of Canadians are tech believers, and they believe that technology will produce better jobs, better opportunities, and generally make their life better. Half of Canadians are tech skeptics, and they're worried about job loss, they're worried about privacy and data breaches, and they're concerned with their own ability to keep pace with change. And I think it is really important for anybody in the public sector who is working on things involving digital to keep this in mind, that even though I suspect most of you in the room here today fall in the tech believer category, given the work you're doing, given your socioeconomic status, a good chunk of the people that we work with aren't so sure. And so we are in the midst of a major revolution in how government develops and delivers services, but the people that we are developing those services for are still undecided as to what some of the impacts of this are going to be. So we've got to bear that in mind. And here's the bad news. That pace of change is only getting faster, right? Alex talked this morning about some of the very far-reaching changes that we might see, 20, 30, 50 years from now. But even in the relatively short term, of the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years, there are some big things that are coming and are already in place that are going to make that rate of change we've seen over the last decade or two pale in comparison to what's coming next, right? And I think about just a few technology trends in particular that I give a lot of thought to these days in terms of how they're going to impact government and impact society, right? One of them is augmented and virtual reality. For those who aren't familiar, virtual reality, what the folks are wearing on their heads in the picture up there, is that very immersive experience. Augmented reality, probably the best example people might be familiar with is Pokemon Go, which was probably the first mass-used augmented reality application. But that notion that increasingly we may have a digital layer that we are interacting with even in the real world. That we're going to have some kind of digital interface between us and our interactions with each other and even our physical surroundings, right? I mean, everybody in this room, I'm sure, has a smartphone in their pocket, and those smartphones have huge ability for us to connect with others, but increasingly to give us digital information about the space that we're in. And for governments, this actually raises some fascinating new challenges, whereas this moves from purely being in the realm of entertainment to being something that could affect sectors like healthcare and transportation and you name it. Government's going to have to think about how does it regulate the public interest and protect the public good in a world where increasingly we have digital interwoven into our lives in a very direct way. I think about artificial intelligence and as AI starts to move down the hype cycle but starts becoming very real, there are huge possibilities, as you've heard and will hear over the next couple days, in terms of how it may be being able to accelerate in some ways how government provides services, but also provide some really ethical challenges around how we use data and how do we regulate AI in a responsible way. And then finally, automation. We can think about self-driving cars as being kind of the thin edge of the wedge on this, but particularly when we take automation and AI and combine them, we have the very real possibility that in the next decade, entire segments of our economy will change beyond recognition, and both for the good, but also for the bad. And this is, I think, where a lot of the anxiety from Canadians come around some of these changes that are coming. And governments are going to have to keep up with this, right? All of you in the next few years are going to be asked in your respective domains that you work in to have to think about how these new technologies are changing the services or policies or programs that you're working on. Now, the reality with this is that as technology gets more and more interwoven into our lives, the people who create that technology start having inordinate amounts of power. This is kind of a tongue-in-cheek, look at that concept from the very geeky comic XKCD, which I recommend you check out if you're not a reader of it. But that notion of we've got all these governance processes in place for a lot of things we do in government, but if the technology has become central to how we get things done, then the people who understand that technology start having the real power about what we're able to do and what we aren't able to do. And I really like this quote from Carl Sagan that gets into some of these issues. And Carl wrote this as part of a book that came out about 25 years ago, where he was thinking about the impact of technology on society and how it might change things. And he was talking about this from kind of a future tense perspective, but I would argue that we are largely there today. That we are in a world where technology is increasingly fundamental to almost anything government tries to do, and to be frank, we are woefully unprepared to have some of those discussions. And you're seeing that reflected now in some of the conversations that are happening south of the border around trying to regulate large social media providers, whether antitrust should be pursued against some of the big tech companies, and we're doing it from a place of information asymmetry. Where the people who have been entrusted, whether they be elected officials or whether they be public servants, frankly have less information at their disposal than the people who are actually creating these technologies. So if we accept that this is the reality, if we accept that this is the world that we are in, then one of the implications behind that is that every policy issue is a digital issue. And I'd be interested to hear people's thoughts about this afterwards, but my sense of it is that increasingly, no matter what area of government you work in, no matter what policy issues or areas you are involved in, digital technology is impacting that in some way, shape, or form. It is impacting it as a delivery mechanism for those programs and services, but it is in many cases actually impacting the programs and services themselves that you're working on. I did some work last year with Transport Canada, our federal transportation regulator, And it was amazing because they have a major digital transformation initiative going on in their department. And it's not just about how do they lean their processes, but it's being driven in part because the actual thing they're regulating, the transportation sector, is going through this enormous transition. Where just to give you one example, the people who work on automotive regulations, in the past, they needed people who were mechanical engineers or automotive engineers or electrical engineers. Today, they need computer scientists. Because for a self-driving car, it's actually the computer code behind that self-driving car that is the biggest regulatory issue, not the mechanical bits that make it drive. And these are the kind of changes we're going to be seeing happening in hundreds of places across governments around the world over the next little while. And so the implication is that digital impacts everyone. This is another quote from Tom Loosemore, who I mentioned earlier, who was one of the UK government's digital services co-founders. And Tom was testifying before a UK parliamentary committee last year. And I really think it sums up well this notion that this is something that every part of government has to be cognizant of and has to start addressing. We've gone from the era where I think 10, 20 years ago, digital or technology was viewed as kind of an IT thing, right? That was the job of the CIO. And their job was to make sure we had the tools that we needed to get the job done, and it was often lobbed over the fence to them. Now this is something that is demanding change from all of our organizations in a much more holistic way than we had in the past. And so I think, for all of you, one of the challenges coming out of this is, so how do we take these new approaches, these new philosophies to doing governance, to doing service design, and apply them across our organizations? And I've been thinking about something over the last year or so that I kind of have conceptualized as the digital government pyramid. There's a longer article that I wrote about this, but I'll give you the concept in kind of a nutshell. So I think at the top of that pyramid is what I call leadership and policy. And over the last decade, I think this is primarily where we've been focused as governments. And I say governments kind of agnostically, federal, provincial, municipal. Right? We've been worried about putting in place the right policies. We've been worried about our governance structures, creating chief digital officer positions, creating kind of enterprise-wide governance bodies around digital. We've seen Pathfinder projects like the Canadian Digital Service that I was involved with launching federally. The BC Dev Exchange here is another good example of that. And these are all good things. And I think in a large hierarchical system, that's probably the right place to start. And a lot of the goal behind this has been to say, how can that leadership and policy layer impact the platforms and processes of government, right? This is the big meaty stuff in the middle, the re-engineering of how we do things, the big legacy systems that we're trying to move, the big legacy processes and policies that we're trying to update. But I would argue it's not enough, and I don't think it's gotten us to where we need to go yet, because the reality is, government is big and that legacy extends quite deeply. And so in the last couple of years, I think there's been more and more attention starting to be paid to the base of that pyramid, what I kind of call the people and skills layer. And I think for good reason, because the reality is that ultimately governments are made up of people, right? We like to think about sometimes government as these kind of abstract monoliths, as these org charts we see on a piece of paper, but ultimately it's a group of people who come together to solve problems. And if we're going to shift the organization in a big way, that's only ever going to happen if we can bring everybody along for that journey. And so I think it is only by us tackling that peoples and skills layer that we can get government to where I think all of us in this room and all of you watching today want to see government move to. But what does that look like? Because I don't think it means that every employee in government has to become a data scientist. Not everybody in government has to become a computer scientist. But it does mean that I think everybody needs to have some kind of baseline understanding of how the digital world works. This is an article and kind of a term that I really like from an author named Alex Dunn, who's based out of the UK. And Alex talks a lot about technical intuition. And I think that's a great way of summing up what my ambition would be for the public service, for that people and skills layer in the digital government pyramid. My wish would be that everybody has a baseline level of digital literacy that lets them be able to understand how the modern digital world works, so that they can understand the limits of technology and the possibilities of it, and to be really frank, so that all of you can call BS when you have to call BS on things that don't make sense, right? And feel that you have the confidence to do that. You know, I think about back when I was in university, and both my undergraduate and my master's degrees were in public policy. And as part of those public policy degrees, I was required to do some economics, I was required to do some statistics, not because necessarily I was going to become an economist, but the theory was that if you were going to be an effective public servant in the future, you had to have a baseline understanding of how numbers work, how the economy works, how statistics work. So I would argue we have now crossed that threshold when it comes to technology and when it comes to digital. And I think it is increasingly going to be, I would argue it's tough today to be a public servant and understand digital, and it is going to absolutely be a requirement in the future that if you are going to be an effective public servant at any level of the organization, that you've got that basic understanding of how the digital world works. And so, as part of responding to that challenge, over the last last few months, the last year, I've partnered up with the Institute on Governance. And my work with the Institute on Governance has been essentially kind of tease out that thesis and to say, okay, what would it take for us within the executive cadres within government to help them build that technical intuition, build that digital literacy so that they are able to be more effective in their jobs, regardless of what it might be. So last week we just completed the 4th cohort of this program. And what the program is essentially is a week-long boot camp. And the boot camp brings in executives from all parts of government. It's been primarily federal government, though we've had provincial and municipal government participants as well. We've had over 60 people who've participated in cohorts of this program over the last year. And the participants tend to be split between those who come from an IT background, their CIOs or their team leaders in digital delivery projects, to those who may have very low digital literacy and come from a communications or a policy or a program world. And the theory behind it is that, again, in a week you're never going to make somebody an expert in any of these topics. But how can we bring these public service leaders together and give them an understanding of the big trends that are impacting digital, some of the stuff I talked about earlier. And then part of my theory behind it is that there is a degree of understanding of some core disciplines that every public service leader should have today. And so we spend a day focusing on design thinking. We spend a day focusing on digital technology, both understanding how the modern tech stack works and some of the unique policy constraints that exist within government in terms of implementing technology. And we spend a day focused on data science and understanding both what data is, how you can use data effectively, and demystifying artificial intelligence and some of the other buzzwords that are out there in the technology world. And then finally, we spend a day with them talking about how do you actually take action when you go back to your organizations? How do you bring in modern management practices like Agile? How do you think about recruiting and, importantly, retaining the kind of skill sets that you need to work in a modern, multidisciplinary type of team? And we get all of them to make a commitment to action, to take what they've learned back to their home organizations, but importantly, for them to be able to use each other as an increasingly growing community of alumni, to be able to rely on each other to fight some of those difficult challenges. You know, as Catherine said in the earlier presentation for those who were here, a lot of this work isn't necessarily complex, but it's really hard. And I do think part of the theory of change behind this is that we need to build those human connections, those networks, both within people's organizations, but across the country and across the world, of people who are struggling with these similar issues and these similar challenges. So we've been thrilled with what's been happening behind this, and I'm really excited after a year of doing this program to be able to somewhat confidently say that yes, you can teach digital. This is a set of skills that we can have people learn to be able to at least build up that baseline digital literacy. We're not alone in this. Ours was the first executive-focused program in Canada on this. There's some really exciting stuff happening with the Digital Academy out of the federal government, the Ontario Digital Service here with the BC government out of the BC Dev Exchange. So I think this is an area in the last few years that a lot of people have increasingly woken up to realize that the things that, for those of you who have been involved in the digital space for many years, we've been talking about a lot of the same things for the last decade. Right? If you went to a conference like this 5 years ago or 10 years ago, the vocabulary would be a bit different, but the vision was largely the same. And I think part of what has held us back in being able to get there is that we haven't yet brought along the large base of the pyramid. We haven't still brought along the majority of public servants. And so I'm excited that I think we're now moving into a territory where we're realizing this has to be more than just the job of those who work for the CIO or those who are in a tech team. This has to be the job of everybody, and we're trying to find new ways to be able to bring everybody along on that journey. So I would really, my homework to you is this, is I would think about for yourselves and for those of you who are managers or leaders for your teams, what are the ways that you can find learning opportunities, be them informal or formal, so that everybody is starting to make this a part of their professional development, that they're keeping pace with the changes that we're seeing happening in the world, and that they are all able to kind of see how they and yourselves can be as effective as possible into the future context and the future world that we're all going to be working in. So I want to leave it at that because I do want to leave a few minutes for us to have Q&A, but thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions, your thoughts, your responses. I believe we've got a couple of microphones floating around. Are there any questions or comments from the audience? I'd love to hear from you. Yes, we've got one over there. Someone's coming to you with a mic.
Hi, Ryan. Thank you. I'm interested in the concern around job loss, and I would like to know what is the best example you've seen of an organization address it, because I'm not sure that we have enough people, but we certainly can't do it with less.
Yep.
But we can redirect our efforts.
Yeah.
So I would like your opinion on that.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, well, two things I want to say on this. So one, just hearkening back to the Ipsos data that I shared earlier about Canadians writ large being worried about this. Mike College, who's the president of public affairs for Ipsos Canada, who often presents that data in more depth in my course, Mike often says when they do the focus groups of people about that, right? People who are the tech believers tend to say things like, I hope, I wish, I think this will happen. Whereas the people who are the tech skeptics say, I know someone who lost a job because of automation, right? I had my personal identity stolen. And so I think the people who are most skeptical about this are actually seeing some of this stuff happen, in their lives. I think for the public sector, I think people obviously have this natural instinct to be worried about job losses, right? If we're automating processes, does that mean we're going to have less people? So, long term, probably technology means that our structures of government change dramatically, right? I do think if we look at the trend lines where things are going, a lot of our institutions and systems were designed 200 years ago, right? And if we were going to create a government today, if we had a whiteboard and said, let's create a government today from scratch, I guarantee you there's no way it's going to look the way it does today, right? We've got, we talk about legacy systems in terms of technology, we have legacy government, right? That we have legacy processes. So I think longer term, in a time span of decades, you may see government look dramatically different if we really kind of embrace that revolution fully in terms of what digital does. In the short term, I don't necessarily think it will or should imply job losses, and here's why. And I've seen a couple examples of this in different organizations. So for example, bringing AI in to help speed up decision-making on administrative processes, right? There's a pilot project on this that the Federal Immigration Department has been doing, right? Because what happens inevitably is, 80+% of applications for virtually any government service are routine, right? Very clear, you're qualified, you're not qualified, it's very easy to make that delineation. And there's a smaller percentage, 10-20%, that are very complex. And often it is those folks who don't get the kind of service one-on-one that they need to navigate the system. So I think kind of an immediate answer to that is that bringing automation in, bringing some of these new technological and service design approaches in, what it should hopefully allow us to do is take people away from the very mundane, routine tasks and actually have them focus on the much more complex cases, right? And I think that has two benefits to it. Number one, from a citizen perspective, they're getting much better service. The people who really need the service, the people who are often the most vulnerable, are getting the most service. But from an employee perspective, I mean, nobody enjoys just doing kind of the very routine type of stuff. And actually, I think for employees, if it's done right, should make their jobs more interesting and more engaging and help us with some of the retention issues we sometimes have in the public sector as well. So I hope that helps to answer the question. Any other questions or comments? I think we got one at the back there. Somebody's coming to you with a mic.
Hi, speaking of digital literacy, do you have any books that you might recommend?
And I have so many books I would recommend.
One or two?
Yeah, and what I'll promise to do is this afternoon I will tweet out a couple of books using the hashtag for the conference. So it depends which area you want to go into. I would actually, there's a couple of what I would almost call kind of foundational short articles that are nice for people to start thinking about this stuff in a little bit of a different way. One that kind of immediately comes to mind when you talk about the big culture change that's happening, Jennifer Polka, who was the founder of Code for America, she had a really interesting piece last year called Death Star Thinking and Government Reform. Like Death Star is in the Star Wars Death Star kind of thinking and government reform. And I actually think it's a really kind of, for me, it was a very thought-provoking kind of primer on all issues around this big culture change that we're trying to get government to do in terms of how it approaches digital in a very different way. As a book for those who are interested in getting into thinking about data science and some of the challenges around that, Cathy O'Neil, who is a data scientist and has been a big advocate around kind of ethical issues around AI, came out with a book a few years ago called Weapons of Math Destruction. And it is a great book to kind of look at because she has some really good examples of where data and AI have been misused and how public sector leaders have to be very conscious of that. So those are two that kind of come to mind quickly, but I will tweet out a few more links, and certainly I'm easy to find online, so if folks want to connect with me, I'm very happy to share some thoughts on specific topics. I think we have time for one more question. If there's anybody else who, right over here towards the middle. If somebody's going to bring a mic over to you, I think. I think it's primarily for the benefit of those in the webcast, so they can hear your question too.
Thanks very much. Zachary May with the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing. As we move towards digitizing our processes, I've seen in a lot of the projects that we're talking about making that shift, we're going to start relying on groups like Amazon and other private sector firms to help us make decisions, to help us manage our data, to help us provide services, which I don't know how we would do it internally. And that really scares me as a public servant because we have full control over how we make decisions, manage files, and when there's errors, those are our errors and we're accountable for them. How do we manage this risk of kind of offloading a lot of our processes to groups that don't have a motive in the public interest the same way we do?
It's a great question, and actually it's a good one to end on. This issue that you raised, for me, was part of my motivation to start working in this space. Because listen, let me be clear, we are always going to need the private sector as part of this, right? There's no universe where government is going to build and run all of its technology by itself, and frankly, nor should it, because there's a lot of cases where it doesn't make sense to do that, right? And you want to take advantage of the economies of scale. But what I worry about is, and we could talk about this for a much longer period of time, over the last decade or two, in a lot of governments around the world, there was this big push to outsource everything, right? There was this notion that the private sector can do it more effectively than government can, so we should outsource all of this. And I think the challenge with that has been, in many cases, we atrophied our digital skills within our organizations. And so the solution to what you're talking about is we have to have a balance. And I think making sure everybody has some digital literacy, but also making sure we have space in public service to have some data scientists, to have designers, to have developers, so that we've got the expertise in place, so that when we're dealing with outside folks, you know, ultimately everybody in this room who's a public servant, your job is to protect the public interest, right? And I'm not saying companies can't be socially responsible, they can, but they have different motivations and being pulled in different ways. Public servants uniquely work only for the Queen, right? Their job is only to safeguard the public interest. And so I think that is why it's so important that we have to build up that digital literacy, because again, that asymmetry in terms of power is only going to get bigger over time, and we got to make sure that when government is sitting down at the table with the tech companies and the other players in the space, that we've all got an even deck of cards that we're playing with. So thank you all so much. This has been great, and I look forward to talking to you more over the course of the next couple of days. Thank you.